And last but not least, just a quick bit about law, which Kristina will build on. So, current legal rights for transgender diverse people. The Sex Discrimination Amendment Act of 2013 talks about how someone's gender is determined by their social footprint. So not by legal documents or anything like that, but it's about the way they live their life. So that means that asking for legal documents as proof is illegal, essentially. It's about, that's not exact, well, Kristina will talk more about that later. But this is how someone's gender is determined, not by legal documents. And also that covers, not deliberately or accidentally treating LGBTIQ people poorly, whether by repeatedly using incorrect names or pronouns in a service. And last but not least, the Equal Opportunity Act of 2011, talks about, essentially means that, asking someone about someone's surgeries or genitalia is sexual harassment, and that's covered under that law as well. Okay, I think we're ready.
I might get a look how we
Yeah. Look you up. All right, we're gonna put Chris on.
So we've got Kristina Hoel, who has worked for many years in a range of roles at the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. So Kristina is a legal and policy officer, and her pronouns are she, her.
Hopefully this will stay on. It's a bit disconcerting sometimes when you're holding onto a microphone. But anyway, I thought it'd be better to have the hands-free method. Ooh, excuse me. Feedback? Yes, thank you very much for allowing me to come and talk to you today about how the Equal Opportunity Act applies in the context of family violence service. I'm going to particularly talk to exceptions, exemptions and special measures. Before I do start, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This acknowledgement is important, especially coming from someone like myself. I work for government in the context of understanding that this land was never ceded. So also I'd like to acknowledge that within this room there's a great deal of expertise, people with lived experience in the LGBTIQ community and people with experience providing rainbow services. So what I'd like to do really, I'm not sure if I can prevent that feedback. What I'd like to do really is just to focus on one area, which is the Equal Opportunity Act. And I've got these themes that I'm covering in my session, which are Family Violence Royal Commission, looking at discrimination, looking at responsibility, who's responsible, exceptions, exemptions, special measures, and inclusive service delivery. So, the Family Violence Royal Commission, everyone will be familiar with that. The Commission identified in its final report that there are particular groups that do risk being excluded, that do face substantial barriers in the receipt of services and accommodation, and that we really need to be aware of these groups. We really need to make sure that we address issues of intersectionality, which I'm going to get to. So identifying these groups is really important, and really making sure that your services can be as inclusive as possible. Now, in the context of the Family Violence Royal Commission report, the Commission actually produced, the Victorian Equal Opportunity Human Rights Commission, produced guidelines. And I've got a stack of guidelines for you. I deliberately didn't put them on your seats because I thought I wanted you to have a look at them later on. And I'm going to, throughout my presentation, refer you to different parts of the guidelines. And you can also have access to these slides later on. So if you're thinking, oh, well, I'm not sure where to look, don't hesitate to look for yourselves or to contact the Commission if you've got any questions. So what I'm going to do today is take you through a little bit of the journey of the concepts that's set out in the Equal Opportunity Act. So some of you will be familiar with these concepts, some of them might be a little bit new to people, and they're a little bit tricky. So I've got a little bit to get through today, so what I'm hoping to do is carve out the time to run us through these concepts, take us through some case studies, and then later on I will sort of get some audience participation towards the end, and hopefully we'll have a good amount of time for questions. So what is the Equal Opportunity Act? The Equal Opportunity Act is a law, okay? It's a state-based piece of legislation that makes discrimination unlawful in certain areas of life. And I'll talk about this in a moment. But before we get to discrimination, we get to the very important topic of the positive duty, okay? Because organisations have a positive duty to take reasonable and proportionate steps, measures to eliminate discrimination, sexual harassment and victimisation. What does that actually mean? Okay? It depends on the context. Okay? It depends very much on the size of the organisation, the extent to which you're required to take positive measures, and it really depends on your resources, what the nature of the work that you're doing, and the practicality and the cost of the measures that might be required. But it requires forethinking. Okay? It requires you thinking ahead about the sorts of measures that you need to undertake. And you can see more detail in the Family Violence Guidelines at pages 19 to 21. And it's about prevention. For example, maintaining an equal opportunity policy that outlines the organisation's legal duty to provide respectful and non-discriminatory services that both staff and clients will know about. Having a complaints procedure that's accessible, both within your organisation for employees, staff, and outside your organisation for people who might be accessing your services or your accommodation, that they know that there are complaint mechanisms that are available to them that will deal with a complaint promptly, fairly and impartially, as well as confidentially. Monitoring your service delivery to try and suss out who are people who might be falling through the cracks, identify who your clients are, identify what their needs are, collaborate with target groups, collaborate with people with expertise within target communities so you know that you're doing the right thing and providing as respectful and non-discriminatory a service as possible. Looking at your organisational culture, so having it in your planning that you're going to be looking ahead to think of what needs to be done, to identify issues, to identify barriers that people might be facing when they access your services. So now I'm going to, before I get to discrimination, just noting here on this wheel, it really is about forethinking and the things that are outlined there, that everyone knows that you are accountable to them to provide respectful and non-discriminatory services. But what is discrimination? Okay? Well, under the Equal Opportunity Act, we talk about direct discrimination and indirect discrimination. So direct discrimination is unfavourable treatment in an area of public life, like, for example, goods and services or accommodation or employment, based on an attribute. Okay, I'll talk about attributes in a moment, but direct discrimination occurs in those circumstances. It often happens when people make assumptions about what people with certain attributes need or whether they fit your regular kind of client opening sort of thing. But it's about being aware of our own biases and being aware of people who may fall through the cracks. So you can find out more about discrimination on pages 8 to 10 of the Family Violence Guidelines. And in the area of goods and services or accommodation, like Shamini said, it can be when people repeatedly use the wrong pronoun. It can be when people assume that someone doesn't need a service or accommodation. They assume that someone with a particular attribute doesn't experience family violence. Say, for example, people who are older don't experience family violence. People who are not in heterosexual relationships don't experience family violence. Or people with disability don't experience family violence. Of course, these are all myths, but sometimes those sorts of assumptions can be made when providing services in general. It can be rejecting someone, it could be evicting someone, it can be subjecting to people to unfavourable conditions associated with accommodation, that sort of thing. So, protected attributes. I've been talking about protected attributes, and we have a list of 18 of them in the Equal Opportunity Act. I won't go through them in great depth because we're focusing today very much on issues affecting the LGBTIQ community, transgender people. But you can note there's a list of them. A very common area of or attribute of complaint that's raised in complaints is sex discrimination. That accounts for around about a quarter of complaints that are received by the Commission in the area of goods and services or accommodation. So that's a huge area or a huge sort of attribute-based complaint that's made. And just bearing in mind that a quarter of the population does have disability, so it's reflected in the statistics there too. So in terms of the attributes, do you recognise any of your clients in this list? It's about thinking about where, you know, do the people who come through your doors have those particular attributes. And one thing I do need to do is pause here for a moment and note that the use of language can be damaging, especially when a person in power misuses language. Terminology, it can fail to recognise nuance. So I do apologise in advance if the terminology that I take you through in a moment is jarring. And it's also damaging when our attitudes and language assume that everyone is gender binary, identifying only as male or female, or heterosexual. Unfortunately, the law can be slow to catch up, and aspects of the Equal Opportunity Act are dated. It's a blunt instrument, but it is one that we have to work with for now. Hopefully it will be reformed in time, and that's what we're wanting. So I'm looking at a few definitions here. And here the Equal Opportunity Act defines gender identity to be a person of one sex identifying as a member of another sex, or a person of indeterminate sex identifying as a member of a particular sex, by assuming characteristics of the other sex, whether by medical intervention, style of dressing or otherwise, or living or seeking to live as a member of the other sex. So, as I explained earlier, this is dated because it is assuming gender binary. And also sexual orientation in the Equal Opportunity Act is defined as homosexuality, bisexuality or heterosexuality. And in the Equal Opportunity Act, sex is not actually defined, okay? While sex historically has been understood as exclusively male or female, it is now known and accepted by courts that biological characteristics include variations, and that the sex of a person is not in every case unequivocally male or female. So now I'm going to talk about indirect discrimination, because that's another important area to talk about. Indirect discrimination occurs when there's a requirement conditional practice that is or is likely to disadvantage people with a protected attribute, and it's unreasonable. So if a person imposing a condition can't show that it's reasonable in circumstances, then it might amount to indirect discrimination. And the task of showing that it's reasonable falls to the person who's imposing it. So it's up to, if you're wanting to impose a condition that might be discriminatory, you need to explain why it's reasonable, okay? If there's a risk that it might be viewed as discriminatory. And some examples of indirect discrimination are things like requiring everyone to provide birth certificates to access a service. So for a moment, I'll ask, who might that disadvantage? Who might face a barrier to accessing your services if everyone is required to provide birth certificates to access a service? Refugees? Who else? Yeah, Aboriginal people who tend to have a lower rate of birth certification than many others in the community. Who else? Yes, trans people. And so, or non-binary people, okay? So it's really important when providing a service to provide as inclusive and non-discriminatory service as possible. And also, in the context of family violence, most people may not actually be able to access the documents in any case, even if you had the documentation. So also another example of potential indirect discrimination is where your website and publications don't have easy English or LOTE explanations. Who might that disadvantage? People with low literacy, so you don't necessarily have to have a disability to have low literacy. Something like 44% of people have very low functional literacy, so you have to make sure for everyone that your resources are really accessible when they're online and that they're in good, easy English. But also other people might be affected, like people with disability, people who don't speak English as a first language, that sort of thing. Another example is anyone who wants to use an interpreter at a medical service must pay a surcharge of 20%. So that potentially might be affecting people with low English literacy, other cultural backgrounds, that sort of thing. So potentially discrimination based on race, indirect discrimination based on race. So what we've got to do really is think about those things, but we also have to think about reasonable adjustments. So service and accommodation providers have to make reasonable adjustments, and also employers have to make reasonable adjustments. For people with disability, if it's needed for a person to get access or to gain a benefit from a service. And if they don't, it can amount to indirect discrimination. So what is reasonable in terms of an adjustment does depend on the circumstances, and you can find more information in the Family Violence Guidelines at page 11. And things to consider include things like the nature of the disability, the requirement needed to accommodate the disability, the financial circumstances of the service provider or accommodation provider, the effect of providing the adjustment, the impact on people, or the consequences for not providing the adjustment. And so what you need to do really is have a disability action plan in place that can help you make much more inclusive decisions that can be as accommodating and non-discriminatory as possible. So think about your clients, think about who accesses your services, think about the needs of your clients, and including things like behavioural disabilities. So if people have behavioural disabilities, how are you going to make adjustments for them? What sort of decisions will you need to make? And making sure that you're always auditing to make sure that your services provided are accessible. Everything from the environment, the physical environment of the place, to your website. And you can get information from and knowledge from specialist organisations like Scope. So you can have a review done and you can maintain your service offering to make it as inclusive as possible. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about intersectional discrimination. And I'm sure most of you will be familiar with this term, intersectional discrimination. When we have multiple attributes that form part of our identity, we can sometimes experience multiple forms of discrimination, which impacts us in unique ways. An African-American woman called Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality back in 1989 to highlight the oppression of African-American women and how African-American women have often been left out of the conversation in regard to race, which has often been centred around African-American men. And also left out of the conversation regarding sex discrimination or sexual harassment more recently, which has often been dominated by white women. So the term intersectionality is becoming more widely accepted, and Volume 5 of the Family Violence Royal Commission report makes specific reference to intersectionality and how it really means that characteristics can impact on multiple levels to create multiple forms of discrimination and power imbalances. So, for example, a person who experiences multiple forms of discrimination is impacted more profoundly than if they were simply experiencing one form of discrimination. And for example, intersections of racism, transphobia and disability discrimination can impact people in ways that can't be captured wholly by looking at these things separately. So society's responses to how we experience discrimination, or society's responses to our attributes when we walk around on the street, when we get services, can mean that we experience privilege or discrimination when accessing services. And if we don't experience intersectionality, then we are privileged. This position of privilege can actually blinker us when we receive services. So it means that we might be less likely to identify challenges that are facing people with particular attributes facing multiple forms of discrimination. It might mean we don't see the barriers, we might be less empathetic, we might make more biased judgments about people's ability to access our services. So here am I. I am a middle-aged, cisgendered, heterosexual white woman, and I don't have disability, unlike a quarter of the population, okay? How I experience services and delivery of services might be quite different then to someone who's non-binary, who also has a physical disability, a transgender Aboriginal woman, or a lesbian woman with limited English and acquired brain injury. So we need to see the barriers that are presented by our unconscious bias that may not let us see the outlines of intersectionality. And so intersectional discrimination may mean that it's an overlap that affects people all at once, like a giant roundabout that's blocked at all entry points. we can imagine intersectionality as blocking access to a vital service like the heart muscle being blocked by clotted arteries. That is intersectional discrimination. So we should identify who may face barriers when they access services and how to alleviate these. We have to be aware of social, historic, systemic factors that might impede access. We need to include target groups and collaborate with experts from target groups to address intersectionality. So what I'm going to do now is look at a couple of case studies, okay? So these are just thinking about intersectional discrimination and thinking about the attributes that might be present here in the case of Sharon. So Sharon is a trans woman. She's fled from a violent partner who's threatened to kill her if she left. Also threatened to disclose her history and contact details on social media. Sharon is concerned about the repercussions in her workplace because she's experienced discrimination from her workplace, which has led to her being diagnosed with depression and anxiety. So which attributes might Sharon have? We were talking about the list of attributes a few minutes ago. Yes, so she has disability, okay? So what's really important to think about here is the most important question that needs to be asked when a trans or gender diverse person seeks access to family violence services is whether they need help, okay? There should be no wrong door for Sharon, okay? A trans or gender diverse person seeking family violence services requires services and referrals that will respect and affirm their identity. So if you're seeking to provide a dedicated service to women only, be inclusive in your language and outlook. This should be reflected in your interactions, your wording in websites, staff training about intake and access. Having plain language resources that are inclusive of trans and gender diverse people and a pathway to support people in navigating the service system, okay? When trans women experience family violence, as well as gender diverse people, non-binary people, they may self-exclude from family violence services, fearing stigmatisation, which may or may not be borne out. So this is where you can come in. You're the gatekeepers, okay? So you're the gatekeepers that can mean that people's fears will not be realised when they access a service. So this fear of stigmatisation makes trans or gender diverse people highly vulnerable when seeking to flee family violence. So what we can do in the meantime is get information from the experts, people with lived experience of discrimination. For example, Switchboard, which provides peer-driven support services for the LGBTIQ community. So moving on to the next case study, I'm looking at Jared, who's a gay Aboriginal man seeking a referral to family violence service provision. Jared also has PTSD and is worried about websites that seem to suggest that violence only happens in heterosexual relationships. So which attributes might Jared have?
Sexuality.
Which attributes does Jared have?
Sexuality.
Sexual orientation, that's correct. Yes, his disability. And yes, and his race. So those things may be operating in ways that we need to take care to make sure that then those attributes aren't presenting barriers to Jared when accessing services. So a really important way of addressing this is making language inclusive and not heteronormative in website policies and verbal interactions. Emphasising a message that everyone in any relationship can experience violence and needs support, deserves support. There are high levels of violence experienced by people in same-sex relationships and non-binary relationships, just as in other relationships. Aboriginal people need services that will respect them as one of our First Nations peoples and custodians of the land. Services need to understand the intergenerational trauma and systemic racism and the legacy left by colonisation, genocide and the violent dispossession of land. Due to these things, Jared may distrust service providers and be reluctant to even contact them. Service providers need to assist Jared to manage his mental illness and trauma that's led him to having PTSD. Jared needs services that acknowledge these dimensions and provide him with multifaceted support. So from the moment he makes contact, he knows that he will be treated with respect and there will be no wrong door. So again, people can get knowledge from experts within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. For example, in DGIRRA, spelled D-G-I-R-R-A, Victoria's statewide family violence service, and also become familiar with DELK-JAR, Save Our Way. DELK-JAR is spelled D-H-E-L-K-D-J-A, DELK-JAR. This is an Aboriginal-led 10-year agreement that binds signatories, including family violence services and government who sign up to work to address family violence. So I'll very briefly talk about victimisation, okay? It's unlawful to treat someone badly because they have or intend to make a complaint, be a witness in a complaint, or refuse to go along with someone else or others breaching the Equal Opportunity Act. So they refuse to go along with, say, people who are denigrating another person in the workplace, for example. I won't talk about victimisation in depth because we're really focusing today on other issues, but you need to know that that's an issue. Now I'm going to talk about responsibility, and that's what we call liability in the Equal Opportunity Act. So we need to understand where responsibility lies when a person makes a decision that may discriminate unlawfully. So this slide looks at who is responsible under the Equal Opportunity Act. So individuals are responsible for their behaviour, for example, in employment, in person to person, or when providing services or accommodation. Employees can be gatekeepers, and they have a very important role to play. Also, organisations are bound. They have a positive duty, as I've talked about before, and must not discriminate, sexually harass, victimise, or authorise and assist discrimination. Authorising and assisting is behaviour that specifically encourages and promotes unlawful conduct under the Equal Opportunity Act. So, another thing to be aware of is vicarious liability. Organisations will be vicariously liable for unlawful behaviours unless they've taken reasonable precautions to prevent them. So you can find out more about this in the Family Violence Guidelines at page 14, and also in depth about how to meet your vicarious liability, how to comply with your vicarious liability at Part 4, which is at the back of the Family Violence Guidelines. So taking the steps that you need to take. If you're doing what you need to do as far as your positive duty is concerned, you'll be doing a great job of meeting your vicarious liability. Bearing in mind that if you don't, it can be the subject of a complaint to the Commission and potentially can end up at VCAT, the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, and VCAT can make orders including financial remedies. So I'm going to keep moving along to complaint resolution options. I'll only very briefly touch upon this. When we do Equal Opportunity Act training, general training for organisations, we go into a lot of depth about complaint resolution options and how to access them and who accesses them and all that sort of stuff. But today we're not focusing so much on that. You can see that this slide discusses complaint resolution options, and an organisation needs to communicate this internally and externally. So internally, you need to make sure that your staff are well aware of internal complaint options that are available, and also that employees or staff can go externally and make a complaint about discrimination, sexual harassment or victimisation, but also that your clients, when they're accessing services, that they need to be aware of your complaint policy, that they can make a complaint about the organisation, and that they can also go externally if they wish to. So I'll leave that there, but now I'm going to get to the crux of why I'm here. This is why I am here, to talk about exceptions, exemptions and special measures. Exemptions are set out particularly at pages 14 to 17 of the Family Violence Guidelines, and exemptions, exemptions, and special measures are technical terms. I'm going to quickly write them up on the board. Oops. Exceptions, exemptions, and special measures. By the time I leave today, I aim for you to have just an introductory working understanding of what these concepts mean, but they are tricky, so I don't expect that you'll go away experts. It's actually a relatively tricky area. Exceptions operate to deem certain activities to be lawful if people fulfil certain criteria. Although exceptions exist, exceptions to what otherwise might be unlawful discrimination exist in the Equal Opportunity Act. We do not have to rely on them, so that's a key message. Today, I'm focusing on exceptions particularly relevant to family violence service provision. So, I'm going to focus on goods and services and accommodation, and a little bit on employment where it relates to family violence service provision. In goods and services, a provider of goods and services can discriminate based on disability if a person requires adjustments to be made to the service provision, and either the adjustments are not reasonable, or the person could not participate or gain a substantial benefit from the adjustments, even if the adjustments were made. So service providers in those contexts don't need to implement the adjustments, but must have carefully considered whether to grant them if a person requires them. So you need to have it in place, in your disability action plan, what you're going to do when someone makes a request for a reasonable adjustment, how you're going to respond. You need to be doing so carefully. In accommodation, an accommodation provider can refuse to provide accommodation based on disability when the person's access or use is not reasonable. An accommodation provider may deny access when they couldn't reasonably be expected to avoid the discrimination. For example, they couldn't do so because the nature of the measures required to provide access or the provider's financial circumstances make it unworkable. So again, you need to have done your homework as far as knowing how to respond to those sorts of requests for adjustments and being as inclusive as you possibly can be, but bearing in mind that in the context of a very under-resourced family violence accommodation provider, you may not necessarily have all of what you need in terms of the resources in certain contexts when there are people who may have a very, very complex range of disabilities, for example. But you need to have done your homework. Now, in accommodation, providers can also refuse to provide accommodation for a person when accommodation is established wholly or mainly for the welfare of people of a particular sex, age, race or religious belief. So sex, age, race or religious belief, those attributes. But accommodation providers can't discriminate in the provision of accommodation based on other attributes, for example, sexual orientation or gender identity. And we'll go into a couple of case studies later to illustrate those points better for you. In employment, there are a few exceptions that can allow you to discriminate when you hire staff. For example, when you're offering the role in order to preserve decency or privacy because it involves fitting clothing. So for example, if I go to David Jones and have my bra fitted, it's fitted by a woman. That's a common example. Or you can discriminate when you're a welfare service provider and you're hiring a staff member with an attribute to provide a service for special needs which can be provided most effectively by people with that attribute. Or you're wanting to hire someone in order to implement a special measure. And I'm going to get to what special measures are shortly. So those examples in employment are particularly relevant to family violence service provision. So now I'm going to talk about general exceptions. General exceptions, unlike specific exceptions that apply to particular areas of life, like accommodation or goods and services, general exceptions apply across the Equal Opportunity Act, okay? And again, although exceptions exist, family violence services and others don't need to rely on them. They are there, but you don't have to rely on them. So special needs services. Now that's particularly relevant to family violence service delivery. So in the delivery of goods and services, providers can establish, here we are, they can establish special services, benefits, or facilities that meet the special needs of people with a particular attribute and limit eligibility to that attribute. So I've set out an example there that would be one that would meet that criteria of being a special needs service. Bear in mind that special needs services is not just about providing a special service for people with disability, it could be people with any particular attribute. So in this case, a family violence service offering a tailored program specifically to LGBTIQ community members. So you can do that. You can limit your service offering to a particular demographic. And I have a question.
So if you have the requirement of a male applicant for a men's individual program, is that discrimination or is that allowed?
Well, if you identify that you've got a particular service for a particular need for men who require a men's behavioural change program, that would fit the criteria of being a special needs service, okay? So there are plenty of men's behaviour change programs. One thing that you need to be aware of is the need to be as inclusive as possible in your delivery of that service. So if you have a trans man who's seeking access to that service, they should be able to seek access to that service. But you can limit eligibility to men. You should be able to designate a particular service or psychological counselling to try and change men's behaviour in the context of being perpetrators, for example.
No, sorry, my question was an applicant to facilitate the program. So
Yes, you can. Yes, that's a welfare employment exception. So you're seeking to provide a welfare service or a special needs service. You're a welfare employer, and you're saying, I have a behaviour change program that I'm providing that men can access, and so I want to present you as a male. That's covered. That's an exception. Okay. So the next one that is on our little list here is the law, okay? An exception allows discrimination when the law says you can by authorising or requiring it. And a commonplace example is, say, bars or pubs that limit entry based on age, that they don't allow service of alcohol. Another exception is one that allows discrimination based on a person's disability, pregnancy or physical features where it's necessary to protect health or safety or property of others. So whether conduct is reasonably necessary depends on the circumstances and needs to be tailored to the level of risk. Service providers should investigate whether there are non-discriminatory measures available. Another exception that is in the Equal Opportunity Act is one that relates to religious bodies. Religious bodies can discriminate based on a number of attributes: religious belief or activity, sex, sexual orientation, lawful sexual activity, marital status, parental status, or gender identity, where discrimination conforms to doctrines, beliefs, or principles of the religion, or is reasonably necessary to avoid injury to religious adherents. For example, it's required because the religion dictates that certain action is needed and that acting differently will mean matters genuinely significant to beliefs will not be respected. Service providers need to make this clear in their policies and their websites, so they can't just be travelling along providing services to generally and then just suddenly go, oh no, I don't really want to allow access to an individual because that's based on our religious beliefs. They need to be very transparent about their criteria, and ideally they shouldn't rely on this exception at all. And in fact, 10 religious family violence services that have pledged not to discriminate. In 2018, towards the end of 2018, 10 of the largest faith-based service providers have said they don't actually want or need to rely on the religious exception. So they made a pledge that they're going to provide inclusive and non-discriminatory services to the LGBTIQ community in Victoria. And there were a range of signatories: Anglicare Victoria, Vincent Care, Salvation Army, among others. So if it's good enough for 10 of the, I'll just hold on one moment, if it's good enough for 10 of the most common religious providers, then it's good enough for everyone else, and we would say that people should not rely on that exception. But
hi Kristina, I'm also Kristina.
I was
just wondering, are you able to speak to some of the implications of, for example, the religious exemptions bill?
Are you talking about the federal one? I will talk about that. What I might do is I might park that, if you don't mind. I think it's a really important issue, but I'm going to focus for now on the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act. But it is important, it's an important issue. Implications. Excuse my... Yep. Just being aware that today we're focusing very much on the Equal Opportunity Act and what's happening here in our state, and that issue is definitely one that we need to talk about as well. So, I've looked at those exceptions. A really important take-home message, I haven't dropped anything, I thought I heard something drop, about exceptions is you don't have to rely on them, okay? They do apply in certain circumstances when people fulfil certain criteria to make a discrimination lawful. They can be a defence to a discrimination complaint, but you do have to have evidence or proof that you considered whether an exception applies to your conduct. So you need to have done your research, you need to have some data, you need to have consultation with affected communities. For example, when you're wanting to have implement a service for special needs, for example. So you can find more information about exceptions on pages 14 to 17 of the Family Violence Guidelines. So now I'm going to jump ahead to the next thing, which is exemptions. So we've talked about exceptions that allow certain discrimination in certain circumstances, okay? So when you've fulfilled all of the criteria, you don't necessarily want them, but they are there, okay? So, yes, I have...
Sorry, can I just ask a quick question before you move on? In relation to the exceptions, particularly for religious bodies,
Yes.
So you talked about those faith-based organisations. That was obviously in relation to providing services to clients. How would that impact on those organisations and their employer? Like how they might, just in a general sense, in the context of employing staff, it would depend on how their organisational constitutions were written or that sort of thing?
In terms of whether they're bound by the exception, well, first of all, you don't have to comply. These are not mandatory. Okay, so a religious provider that says we do not want to discriminate in certain circumstances, they are voluntarily entering into a commitment. So ideally, their policies should reflect that commitment. Ideally, you all can hold them to that commitment. Individuals can hold them to that commitment. It's not necessarily a legal commitment so that they've made, but I think you can argue that if you've made a commitment and signed up to it, and you have acknowledged that you don't need to rely on these exceptions, that all of your policies should reflect that. Yeah, for sure.
Can I just ask? You're saying it's not a legal commitment, but so are you saying it's voluntary that a religious body can discriminate because they're saying we don't believe in homosexuality?
Potentially they can, that exception is like a carve-out clause for them, okay, which we would argue it's outdated. We would argue the Commission does not like that exception. We've argued against it. Hopefully the Equal Opportunity Act will be reformed so that the exception is removed, or at very least made much less wide in its scope. So for example, aspects of the exception allow discrimination based on the attributes that I talked about when they're talking about ordination or training people for the priesthood or whatever it is. But in terms of service delivery generally, in particular, we think that it's completely outdated. It is outdated. But we might have to move on to exemptions. Okay, so we've talked about exceptions. Now we're going to talk about exemptions where people can go to VCAT. Okay, they can go to VCAT for an exemption for conduct that would otherwise be discriminatory. Service providers can apply for an exemption that are typically granted for up to 5 years, and they can also be renewed on application. When deciding whether or not to grant an exemption, you can see the slide here where deciding whether or not to grant an exemption, VCAT has to consider whether this would be a reasonable limitation on the right to equality. And you have to back up your application with evidence about why the measure is reasonable and has a non-discriminatory purpose. One thing to bear in mind is that so organisations may need an exemption for some activities but not for others. So a good example is the case of Georgina Martina, a 24-hour women's refuge program which provided family violence services and accommodation to women and children, including males up to 17 years old escaping family violence. So Georgina Martina wanted to provide a safe and non-threatening environment where women would feel comfortable accessing counselling. And Georgina Martina sought an exemption to employ women in all of its roles and to limit eligibility to services to women only. VCAT considered that Georgina Martina didn't need an exemption to limit eligibility to its services or welfare accommodation. So those were covered, in terms of people accessing service. In terms of accessing services, it could limit eligibility or accommodation. But in terms of restricting employment to women only in all roles, VCAT said it would need an exemption. If it was only wanting to employ women in frontline crisis roles that were dealing, with clients escaping family violence, then the welfare employment exception that I talked about would apply. But because it was potentially involving a mix of kind of roles, then they would have to have an exemption. So, you know, for example, back of house roles like the accountant or, you know, the IT person, those roles would not be more effectively provided by men, okay? But if you've got roles that are in front of house, talking with people in crisis situation, clearly the welfare and employment exception would apply. So the take-home message with this is if you think you've got a mix of services, even if you're a small provider, you should seek legal advice, find out whether you should get an exemption, and if in doubt, apply for an exemption, and like Georgina Martina, in those sorts of circumstances, Georgina, the VCAT is likely to grant it. Those are very commonplace exemptions. So, what I need to do now is take you to special measures. Okay, special measures are a very proactive, very potentially highly positive action that you can take to address disadvantage. And you can see here we've got a bit of a complicated looking slide with the sort of criteria that need to be met for a special measure. You don't need to go to VCAT for a special measures declaration. So you don't need a declaration made by VCAT that you can implement a special measure. But what you need to do is have a think ahead of time about these criteria. Okay, special measures have particular characteristics. They target a particular group, like people with particular attributes, such as age or race or trans people, etc., with the purpose of realising or achieving substantive equality. Okay, so commercial profit is not an acceptable sort of legitimate purpose to fulfil a special measure. So whether it's going to make you more marketable, no. It's about realising substantive equality. And you need to have these four things. You need to have good faith, you need it to be likely, reasonably likely to achieve the purpose, you need it to be proportionate, and you need it to be justified. So, good faith. The group that you're seeking to benefit should support the measure. So you need to pilot, you need to be thinking, you know, can I pilot with my target group? You need to get advice from the experts in the target group. Think about unconscious bias, think about stereotyping that might be going on, and think about the gaps and how you can address the gaps. And again, whether it's reasonably likely to achieve its purpose, is it properly tailored? Can you as an organisation carry it out effectively? So do you have the expertise to do it? Do you need to get support to do it? What do you need to do to implement this special measure? Is the special measure proportionate? So the measure shouldn't go any further than what is required to achieve the purpose of the special measure. So for example, if you're appointing membership to a board and you're wanting to attract a target demographic, you don't need to appoint all board members to be people of that attribute, but you might say half, for example, and set half as your goal. Is it justified because members of the group have a particular need for advancement or assistance? So this is really important too, because it's about, well, collaboration again, finding out from your target group, okay? Do they actually need this? Do they want it? Or are you imposing something on them that they don't really need or want? So you can self-declare, once you've gone through these criteria, once you've sorted it out, once you've got the data to back up your special measure, then you can self-declare it in all your publications to people who may want to access a special measure. And the VCAT has said that if you fulfil these criteria, you don't need to go and make an application to them for a declaration. You can just get on with that good work. So examples of special measures are things like sporting events for the LGBTIQ community, advertising and employing underrepresented community members to designated roles for the purpose of, you know, achieving substantive equality. Women's only events for religious or cultural reasons. That's a very commonplace special measure. So, hooray, we've got to, okay, we've got 10 minutes left. We're going really well. We have got to the point where we can talk about some case studies, okay? So, I'm going to get you to think about these case studies. Think about which fits best into this scenario. An exception, exemption, or a special measure. So you've got a family violence service that wants to advertise staffing roles to women only across the whole organisation. Which fits best? Is it an exception? Is it an exemption? Or is it a special measure, which is like a handshake between communities? Okay? It's a handshake in terms of collaboration, your family violence service community and the target community that you're wanting to advance. So, which fits best? Exception, exemption, special measure, which one? Yay, tick, golden tick to everybody. This scenario raises the need for an exemption. The provider has frontline roles involving direct contact with traumatised women. Welfare employment exception is likely to apply to frontline roles, but the scenario does suggest that some roles may not actually involve contact with clients. So advertising for these roles may require an exemption from VCAT, noting the Georgina Martina case. So we've got a mix of roles that might exist, or even an individual role that might have a mix of service offerings that you might be targeting one group, but you also might be providing services more broadly. In that context, an exemption is required. Next one, we have a community health service wants to address underemployment of Aboriginal people, wishes to target trainee placements of graduate roles to Aboriginal people. It's collaborated with the local Aboriginal community to make this happen. What fits best? Special measure. Excellent. It targets Aboriginal people, aiming to address inequalities, supported by the Aboriginal leaders, tailored to meet the needs of that group. And it's proportionate and justified because there's a need for the assistance and involves targeted roles only. So having the backup of data, that collaboration again is really, really important as far as when you're wanting to set up a special measure. It'll make it far more meaningful and enduring as well as an arrangement. So last one in terms of our case studies here. Family violence service only open to women, okay? A family violence service wants to provide a dedicated service to women only who are escaping family violence, which fits into this scenario. This raises an exception, okay, being the welfare accommodation exception, limiting eligibility based on sex. So remember, there was the capacity to limit eligibility to welfare accommodation based on those four attributes: sex, age, race, or religious belief or activity. One thing to be really important to be aware of is that providers need to be careful about their messaging regarding eligibility and how it's defined. They need to be as inclusive as possible. Although the exception does limit, can limit, based on those four attributes, it does not permit discrimination based on other attributes like gender identity or sexual orientation, for example. Trans women should not be denied entry to a women-only refuge, therefore. And a key point to make is that providers don't have to rely on these exceptions, and this includes religious family violence service providers. And when trans or gender diverse people contact a service, the focus should be on whether they need help. People who are non-binary should be supported to provide, to find respectful, affirming services. So you can refer to the Family Violence Guidelines for assistance with questions relating to trans or gender diverse people at pages 22 to 24. And I had a question.
Yeah, I had a question. So if your service is stating that it's a dedicated service to women, but it will actually respond to trans women or non-binary people, is not using the word woman or women discriminatory? Or non-inclusive to those people?
What I would say, if you're saying we are providing services to women only, we would say you need to be as inclusive and non-discriminatory as possible in terms of your eligibility criteria, in terms of who is a woman, okay? And that trans women should not be discriminated based on that. Does that answer your question?
It does, but it just sounds like it doesn't sound very inclusive.
What you can do is, well, yeah, I mean, you can say, yeah.
Those people know that they are actually.
Yeah. So that's what you can do. You can make it clear in your own publications, in your own messaging, both verbally. You can say that you don't have to. You don't have to rely on this exception. You don't have to use those words. But we do have some exceptions that allow a carve out in those circumstances. But if you're wanting to ensure that everyone understands you're going to be inclusive, do that, including your publications, that everyone is welcome. People who are trans, women, for example. So in terms of what does an inclusive service delivery offering look like, part 4 is very much focused on that of the guidelines. So you can look at the guidelines for yourselves and see what sort of steps you can put in place to implement inclusive service delivery. And what does this look like? Well, it's these things that are on the slide. It's ensuring that people are aware of intersectionality, that people have training, that there's transparent eligibility criteria and as inclusive and welcoming criteria as possible, that staff understand what they need to do when people are accessing services, both at intake and all the way through when they're providing services and accommodation. That basic things like asking someone about their pronouns is okay, but asking people questions should be done in a private kind of context, should be done respectfully. People's should be respected and the pronouns should be used correctly. Privacy of medical history is really important. Look at page 23 of the Family Violence Guidelines. Asking about medical history may be discriminatory if this information is used to bar access. People shouldn't have to prove their sex or gender identity. And there should be appropriate behaviour management concerns that are based on genuine concerns rather than stereotyping. And so look at page 23 of the Family Violence Guidelines. Always ensuring that staff training and capability is audited and updated, that people receive training regularly. Collaborating where possible with groups that you assist and being aware of intersectionality is critical. Getting that knowledge from experts with lived experience. So that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it for my formal part of the presentation. Knowing everyone here can contact the Equal Opportunity Commission, Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission for more information about discrimination. If you want to know more about the exceptions, exemptions or special measures, don't hesitate to get in contact with me if you'd like to. Shamini, I'll say, Shamini, if you'd like to pass on my contact details, I'm totally happy to continue this conversation because I think it's really important. Now, there was a question that we parked, and I might get to that right away, and there may be hopefully a little bit of time for some questions, 5 minutes. So, excellent. Okay, this is a really sort of sobering piece of legislation. There's been an exposure draft bill presented by the Federal Parliament, the Religious Freedoms Bill. Although there are a couple of aspects to the bill that are not so controversial. They're making discrimination based on religious belief or activity unlawful at a federal level. So we would say that's sort of